Hi, everyone. We're going to be talking about European and Latin American theater in the late 1800s. Just like in the Americas, we see a lot of nationalism in European and Latin American theater during this time period. We're also seeing a lot of industry and trade, and as a result, unions and workers' rights are a pretty big deal still. However, we're moving out of the Romantic era and we're thinking a lot more pragmatically. Um, Artists, anarchists, they're wanting to find realistic ways of changing their position, and that's what's going to give us the rise into the realistic form of theater. So the beginnings of realism are really with Auguste Comte. He is not a playwright, he is an author, and he wrote Positive Philosophy and Positive Polity. He thought that sociology was the most important of all sciences, and that if we applied our scientific knowledge to sociology, we could discover the root of societal issues, and as a result, we could find solutions to those societal problems. He preferred material explanations over metaphysical explanations, wasn't really interested in what God has to say about what the world's problems are. And this really appeals to scientists and philosophers and also a lot of artists. They really wanted to figure out if they could make art scientific and realistic. Um, the foundations of realism are found in scenic painting all the way back to the time of the Greeks, and but especially from the Italian Renaissance on, we see pictorial illusion, which and also the realism of appearances. We saw that back in the 1700s, right? So realism, though, as a conscious movement, really begins in France. Um, so the main tenets of the new movement are art must depict truthfully the real physical world, and since only the contemporary world, which would be whatever world the playwright is currently living in, only the contemporary world can be observed directly, truth can be attained more fully through impersonal, objective observation and representation of the world around us. They also wanted to represent scientifically observed actions of the interdependence between a character and whatever environment that character might find themselves in. Um, During the late 19th century, Russia wavers between reform and strict censorship. So it's surprising to find that really realism appears in Russian drama a lot earlier than it does in the rest of Europe, and that it's a lot more uncompromising. So, first of all, we have Ivan Turgenev, and he wrote about domestic detail that would reveal the inner turmoil of the characters that were situated in that domestic play. And we have Alexander Ostrovsky. He wanted to eliminate caricature and avoid the stage tricks and the spectacle that was so popular in the melodrama, in particular, spectacle that really has nothing to do with the plot of the play and it doesn't move the story along. He liked to concentrate on characters and the relationships of the characters to each other, the relationships of the characters to their physical circumstances. Um, so even though realism is starting to spring up in Russia, it's by no means the most popular of all the forms. And so popular theater is still melodrama, farce, musical drama, and romantic spectacles. During this time, public theater expands, the quality of provincial theater improves. The focus is still really on imported stars who tour. Um, and even though the realism in drama uh, in Russia is a lot further along than it is in a lot of the rest of Europe, the trends toward the accuracy in settings and costumes is a lot slower to develop in Russia. However, by 1870, it starts to become the managers of the theaters become a lot more concerned with accurate settings, and so there is a need for a special class in theatrical design at the Art Academy. So we aren't just having um, painters that paint on a canvas one day and then come in and paint your backdrops. There's a specific technique that is being taught for theatrical design. Uh, in Germany and Austria, really we see a lot of variety theaters, cabarets, summer theaters, operettas. There isn't a ton of new drama being written in these countries. Um, they use Shakespeare, Lessing, Goethe, and Schiller, and really those plays make up the repertory. They don't feel like they're missing a native drama until right around 1890. So we'll talk a little bit more about them in later chapters. Um, the major troops are supported by the government, which really that protects those major troops. In a time when in the rest of Europe, their major troops are sort of declining. The major troops in Germany are doing fairly well because of the government supporting them. Um, and in 1875, we finally see that historical accuracy is accepted as the ideal in pretty much all German language troops. Still, and I feel like we've seen this in many places. Even when we start to reach in towards historical accuracy, they're still reusing their old scenery. They're still having people bring in their costumes. So it's not that they've accomplished it, it's that it's the ideal. It's what we are going to work towards. So in France, we have, I think I mentioned before, our first conscious implementation of realism. So there are several playwrights that push France to this point. The first being Eugene Scriba. So Eugene Scriba popularized the well-made play structure, and this well-made play structure is important because our realists in the last part of this century are going to base all of their works off of this structure. So these are the four tenets of this. First of all, careful exposition and preparation. We want to make sure that everything that comes after, there's a foundation for all of the actions and events that's laid out at the beginning. We have a cause to effect arrangement of events. Because this happened, then this thing happened, and then the next thing happened, and then the next thing happened. We don't have Deus ex machina, right? We don't have things swooping in to save the day that we did not see coming. He builds all of his scenes to a climactic moment, and he likes to manipulate the script with withheld information, startling reversals, and a lot of suspense. So, Alexander Dumas Fils, he wrote what we call thesis plays. Thesis plays are about current social problems. So he would essentially set forth a thesis. This is how we solve this social problem. And then we would get to see the thesis played out in the script. He was a realist. He felt like his duty was the betterment of society. And so that's what all of his plays seek to do. Then we also have Emile Augier. He wrote about the struggle for supremacy between the impoverished but proud nobility and the well-to-do and ambitious middle class. He also treated the power of money and the influence of the church on politics. So both of these guys are really pushing the envelope and pressing forward on these social problems. A name that you probably will recognize who was not a realist, so don't get it confused, is Jacques Offenbach. He popularizes the operetta in France. So the operetta is a mixture of song and speech, so it differs from the opera. A lot of fantasy, a lot of crazy antics, and irreverent subject matter. And he wrote what some of you in musical theater history will remember, Orpheus in the Underworld, and that is where we get the can-can. So the long run is the standard in France. If any show plays less than 100 performances, it's considered to be a failure. As a result of this, we are now hiring performers for specific shows rather than hiring actors to be in a troupe and learn a repertory. There's a lot of strict censorship in France at this point in time, and so it encourages conservatism in our choice of plays. And that kind of censorship is eventually going to stimulate concern for reform, and it's going to push us into the modern era in French theater. Right now, there are two demands of theater in France. One is realism, which means that a manager and a director is going to have greater control and oversight over all pieces of the production so that everything works together into one cohesive piece. And virtuosity, which really ends up being sort of a defiance of control. That starring performer, right? That virtuoso. We want to see this one particular person perform, and we don't care if they match everything else that's going on. Adolphe Montigny is the first director that treats directing as an art in France. And I'm actually just going to read to you some of the things that he did, which I think are really interesting because we have, we mentioned earlier how blocking was so set that we didn't even really have blocking rehearsals up until this point. All the actors knew where they were going to stand. They were going to stand in a semicircle around the front of the stage, and whoever was speaking was going to step forward or step more towards the center and speak and then step back into their place. And so he wants to break this, but he doesn't go about it just by going into rehearsal and sort of barking at them where to go. So here are some of the things that he did. I just think it's really fascinating. So he would place a table downstage center that would prevent the actors from taking up the semicircle formation. Then he would put chairs around the table, seat the actors, and make them speak to each other rather than to the audience because that had been very typical in the past. And then he would furnish his settings like real rooms. He would place props such as cigar boxes, handkerchiefs, or letters about the stage that motivated movement from one place to another. So finally, we have the motivation of movement rather than I've got to get out of the way for the next person who's speaking. Um, Also, in France, they've realized they need a costume designer. So we have a costume designer emerging in this time period and also hiring staff for that designer. Realistic acting is going to increase. Actresses are going to knit on stage, actors will smoke or play cards. They really want to try to simulate what would really be happening. And here, like everywhere else, we're going to glorify our starring performers. Francois Delsarte should sound familiar to you because we mentioned him in The Music Man, that Eulalie McKechnie bespeaks Delsarte. Um, so now this joke will make so much more sense to you. He was interested in creating a methodology of acting through scientific observation. So he developed what is called the laws of stage expression. He would divide human experience and behavior into the physical, mental, and spiritual, and then he would relate each of those three things to every action, thought, and emotion. And then he divided and subdivided the body into parts, and he would relate each part to the physical, mental, and spiritual. And eventually, he creates an elaborate scheme that describes how each part of the body can be used to communicate specific emotions, attitudes, or ideas. So, if I move my pinky in such a way, it will tell you that I am excited, but only if I move my pinky one way and I move my wrist this other way at the same time. If I move my wrist the opposite way, it might convey a different emotion. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of the actors that train under Delsarte seem to be a little bit mechanical. But this is also a forerunner of, um, you know, Chekhov's physical gesture. Um, this idea that, and the idea that whatever I do on stage, however I hold my body, whatever way I move my hand or wrinkle my brow or whatever it may be, is going to convey some kind of meaning to the audience, which we still use today. In Italy and Spain, we don't see a ton of forward movement in the theater. Italy's main impact is really through their touring stars. And in Spain, we have a lot of chaotic conditions surrounding theater. Eventually, they create some guidelines. Um, just because it's chaotic doesn't mean they're not doing a lot of theater. They are. They build quite a few theater buildings. One of them is the Teatro Español, which ends up being the Spanish National Theater, which is still in existence today. All right, Latin America, obviously a gigantic concept that I'm going to try to pare down into just a couple of slides. Um, so let's talk about Mexico. Mexico doesn't have a ton of opportunity to develop a professional theater in the late 19th century. Even going back to when it settled, it's never really settled. So um, the Jesuits take theater away from uh, Mexico for a little bit, which upsets them and causes a lot of resentment. Napoleon conquers Spain in 1808, and then open rebellion breaks out in New Spain, which is Mexico, in 1810. They fight for 11 years. They establish the independent Empire of Mexico in 1821, and then it starts to lose all of its different land masses. It loses Central America, it loses Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, and that's all the beginning of the 1800s. We have the War of Reform, occupation of the French. Then there's revolts in 1876 and 1880. So, we have talked before about Maslow's hierarchy. When you don't have that foundation of safety, when you're constantly fighting, you don't know what's going to happen next, there isn't going to be a lot of artistic expression on a large scale. Um, so we've got, sorry, and then we have Brazil. So the thing that I find interesting about Antonio Jose um, is that we have this Brazilian play on a national theme, and I wanted to bring that up mostly because of Augusto Boal, who is another Brazilian that is going to use theater also to help his nation. And so I just kind of wanted to throw that in as a bonus. And Romanticism is going to dominate in Brazil by the 1840s. Cuba is where we see the most extensive theatrical activity in all of Latin America. So we have Francisco Covarrubias. He is the father of Cuban theater. And unfortunately, blackface is not just limited to the United States. So he develops the Negrito, which is a farcical blackface character, becomes incredibly popular until finally some version of the character is going to become a trope in almost all Cuban comedy. And then we also have Joaquin Lorenzo Luaches, and he is the most nationalistic of the Cuban writers. He is highly critical of colonialism, and so writes against that, and likes to ridicule foreign fashions. And this creates the Havana Bufo. So the Havana Bufo are burlesques of Spanish melodrama and zarzuelas. They become very popular in 1866. They're suppressed because there's a rebellion against Spain, and then they're revived and performed from 1879 to 1898, so for a pretty long span of time. There are really few cities in Latin America that are able to support full-time acting companies. Professional theater is really, at this point, provided by touring companies from Spain, Italy, and France. There are troops from Mexico and Cuba that are going to travel, but they're featuring European actors and they're performing a European repertory. So most of the companies are amateur. The plays by local dramatists are written for the amateur companies, and so we just don't have a lot of information on what those plays were. Um, and I'm sorry, let me go back. One last thing to remember is that also because of all the upheaval that's happening in Latin America, really the West has such a heavy influence on it that much of what's going on in Latin America is just sort of a twist on what's already happening in European countries. So it's not that, obviously Latin America is a very large place with a lot of different people groups, and we're not trying to minimize that by putting it into two PowerPoint slides. It's just that what they're doing is a replication of what's already going on in Europe. They haven't found their own voice yet. They will eventually, and they'll get a little bit more playing time then. I did want to briefly mention Native American quote theater, um, because I think it's natural to wonder when we talk about North American theater why we aren't talking about the Native Americans. And I thought this quote summed it up really well. So, where the European aesthetic draws large distinctions between secular theatricality, like the production of a Shakespeare play, and sacred theatricality, a church service, indigenous peoples who see everything as sacred might distinguish the two as public and private, both of spiritual and aesthetic importance to the tribe, and both incorporating performers, spectators, and a predetermined oral text. And so it's very difficult to define autonomous theater for the Native Americans. Everything is spiritual, everything is theatrical. It all contributes in that way. And so, for that reason, their theater doesn't develop in the same way that our theater does. That's all I've got. Thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you later.